In the quiet spaces between history's loudest moments, there have always been lives that moved differently. Lives that did not march to the rhythm of empires or revolutions, but that were lived quietly, gently, often invisibly. These are the lives of people born with what we now call Down syndrome. Their story is not found in battlefields or royal courts. It is found in ancient burial sites where children were laid to rest with care, in medieval villages where families hid their loved ones from fearful neighbors, in the cold halls of institutions where thousands were forgotten, and finally, in the slow, determined struggle for recognition, dignity, and belonging. To trace this history is to trace how humanity has answered a question that reaches far beyond medicine. What makes a life worth living? How did ancient cultures interpret a child who looked and moved differently? Why were some revered as touched by the divine, while others were hidden away? And how did we move from a world where difference was feared to one where, slowly, unevenly, we began to see the profound value in every life? Before we journey through these centuries of silence and awakening, take a moment to subscribe to Little Historical. It helps a new channel continue to bring stories that deserve to be remembered, stories of those history often left out. And if you're watching from somewhere quiet tonight, let me know in the comments. There's comfort in knowing we're walking this path together. Now, dim the lights. Let the world outside fade. And let us begin. In the quiet spaces between history's loudest moments, there have always been lives that moved differently. Lives that did not march to the rhythm of empires or revolutions, but that were lived quietly, gently, often invisibly. These are the lives of people born with what we now call Down syndrome. Their story does not begin in battlefields or royal courts. It begins in the earth. In 2014, a team of researchers in France uncovered a burial site more than 1,500 years old. Among the remains was a young child, no more than 5 or 6 years old, whose skull bore the distinct features we now recognize as Down syndrome. But what made this discovery remarkable was not the child's condition. It was how the child was buried. Not cast aside, not hidden at the edge of the cemetery. Laid to rest with the same care, the same reverence, as any other member of the community. A small detail, perhaps, but a powerful one. What does it tell us? That long before medicine had a name for this, before chromosomes were mapped or theories formed, some people looked at a child who was different and responded not with fear, but with tenderness. In a world without diagnosis, without any framework to explain why this child moved slowly, spoke late, smiled often, there were only human instincts. And for some, instinct said, protect. For others, it said, revere. Because in many ancient cultures, physical and intellectual difference was not seen as a medical condition. It was seen through a spiritual lens. Some believed such children were touched by the gods, closer to the divine, vessels of a wisdom that ordinary minds could not access. Others, it is true, saw omens of misfortune, signs of imbalance, punishments for sins unknown. Without science, the void was filled by myth, by superstition, by the temperament of the village and the heart of the family. So there was no single answer. Some children were hidden. Others were raised in the center of the home, carried on hips, spoken to softly, loved not in spite of their difference but perhaps because of it. They were, in the truest sense, part of the human family. Always. Not a modern phenomenon. Not a problem to be solved. A thread woven into the fabric of life since the beginning. And then the earth closed over them. For centuries, their stories went unwritten. Their names, if they had names, were not recorded. But the bones do not lie. And in the careful arrangement of a child's grave in a French village, in the rare burial sites of ancient Rome and the Andes where similar remains have been found, we hear something across the centuries. A whisper. I was here. I mattered. I was not forgotten. But as we move forward into the medieval world, that whisper would grow fainter, drowned out by fear, by dogma, and by a silence that would last for nearly 1,000 years. But as we move forward into the medieval world, that whisper would grow fainter, drowned out by fear, by dogma, and by a silence that would last for nearly 1,000 years. Between the 5th and 15th centuries, Europe became a place where difference was not simply misunderstood, it was dangerous. The Church's hand was heavy, its gaze searching. Every deviation from the norm was scrutinized, measured against a narrow definition of what it meant to be made in the image of God. A child born with soft features, a slower mind, a gentler way of moving. These were not seen as variations in the human tapestry. They were seen as signs. Signs of sin, perhaps. Signs of divine displeasure. Or worse, whispers of something demonic that had slipped through the cracks of the holy world. In rural villages, news of such a birth would travel fast. Whispers would fill the streets, curl around the doorways of neighbors. What had the mother done? What curse had the family brought upon themselves? Was this child a punishment, a test, or a warning? There were no answers. Only fear. And fear, when it has no outlet, often finds one. Some children were hidden, kept indoors, their existence a secret shared only between walls. Others were given over to monasteries or convents, where the religious were tasked with caring for the sick and the vulnerable. In some cases, this brought safety, food, shelter, a quiet life. In others, it meant isolation, a removal from family that felt as final as death. The records are sparse. The medieval world was not kind to those who could not speak for themselves. And yet, even in this silence, there are fragments that refuse to be buried. Art from the period occasionally depicts figures with features we now recognize as Down syndrome. Shepherds in illuminated manuscripts, angels in church frescoes, humble saints with round faces and gentle eyes. We cannot know if the artists were intentionally portraying individuals they knew, or if they were simply painting what they saw around them. But the message endures. These faces were present. They were seen. And sometimes, they were placed in sacred scenes, as if to say that the divine had room for them. In monasteries, there are rare accounts of monks referring to such individuals as innocents, souls closer to God, unburdened by the sins that tangled ordinary minds. These were not medical terms. They were theological ones, but they carried a kind of grace. A recognition that value could exist outside the usual measures of intellect or productivity. Still, we cannot romanticize this age. These were exceptions, not the rule. For most, the medieval world was one of shadows, of families carrying shame in silence, of children growing old behind closed doors, of lives that left no trace in the written record. They were there. They endured. But their stories were not written down. And the silence that wrapped around them would hold for centuries, until the world began to ask new questions. Questions that would, in time, pull them from the shadows and into a light that had been waiting for them all along. And the silence that wrapped around them would hold for centuries, until the world began to ask new questions. Questions that would, in time, pull them from the shadows and into a light that had been waiting for them all along. The 19th century brought a shift, not immediately toward acceptance, but toward something that felt, at first, like progress. The rise of modern medicine gave the world its first clinical description of Down syndrome, delivered in 1866 by a British physician named John Langdon Down. He saw a pattern in the patients at the Ellswood Asylum, the rounded faces, the almond-shaped eyes, the gentle demeanor, and he gave it a name. But the name he chose, Mongolism, reflected the prejudices of his time, linking the condition to racial theories that have long since been abandoned. It was a label born not of cruelty, but of ignorance, and it would cling for more than a century. Still, with that paper, something shifted. People with Down syndrome were no longer invisible. They were now a category, a diagnosis, a subject for study. And in the laboratories and lecture halls of Europe and America, a new kind of attention began to form. It was not, however, the attention of compassion. The early 20th century brought with it the eugenics movement, a philosophy that swept through the Western world with terrifying speed. The idea was simple, seductive, and deadly. Improve the human race by eliminating the traits deemed undesirable. People with Down syndrome were labeled unfit, defective, a burden on families and nations. In the United States, in Canada, in Sweden, and elsewhere, laws were passed allowing the forced sterilization of individuals with intellectual disabilities. Young women and men were taken from their families, often without their knowledge or consent, and rendered incapable of bearing children. They were denied not just parenthood, but a fundamental piece of their humanity. And then came the darkest chapter. In Nazi Germany, the ideology of racial purity reached its logical conclusion. The T4 program was designed to eliminate lives deemed unworthy of living. Children with disabilities, including Down syndrome, were taken from their parents to special clinics. Families were told their children would receive better care. Instead, they were killed by starvation, by lethal injection, by gas. Their names were erased, their deaths hidden behind falsified medical records. By the time the program was officially halted, more than 70,000 people had been murdered. The architects of this horror were not monsters in the usual sense. They were doctors, nurses, bureaucrats, people who believed they were serving a higher purpose. And in that belief, they revealed something chilling about what happens when science is divorced from ethics, when efficiency becomes more important than compassion, when some lives are deemed worth less than others. But even in that darkness, there were those who resisted. Parents who hid their children. Clergy who forged baptismal records to protect families. Nurses who risked their lives to warn parents before the trucks arrived. Small acts, perhaps, but they were seeds. And after the war, when the world finally saw what had been done, those seeds began to grow. The silence that had held for so long was about to break. The silence that had held for so long was about to break. In the years after World War II, the world struggled to make sense of what had happened. The Nuremberg trials exposed the chilling efficiency of the T4 program, and for the first time, the systematic murder of disabled people was spoken of in open court. But acknowledgement was not yet action. Families who had lost children were left to grieve alone. Survivors who had been sterilized or institutionalized remained hidden. Yet something had shifted, quietly, in the hearts of parents who refused to accept that their children were better off unseen. In the 1950s and 1960s, small groups began to form. Mothers who had been told to place their children in institutions started meeting in church basements and living rooms. They shared stories, strategies, and a growing conviction that their children deserved more than a life behind locked doors. These were not activists in the traditional sense. They were ordinary people who had discovered an extraordinary truth, that their children could learn, could grow, could love, and could contribute. They began to demand what had never been offered: education. In 1975, the United States passed the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, guaranteeing every child the right to a public education. It was a landmark victory, the first of many. Schools that had once turned children away were now required to open their doors. And when those doors opened, something unexpected happened. Teachers discovered that students with Down syndrome could learn. Classmates discovered they could be friends. Families discovered they were not alone. Around the same time, the medical world was making its own discoveries. In 1959, French geneticist Jérôme Lejeune identified the extra chromosome that causes Down syndrome. It was a breakthrough that finally gave the condition a biological explanation, stripping away the last remnants of superstition. But science alone did not change hearts. It was the visibility of people with Down syndrome, in schools, in workplaces, in communities, that began to shift the culture. In the 1980s and 1990s, self-advocates began to speak for themselves. They testified before legislatures, appeared in films, and started organizations run by and for people with disabilities. Their message was simple but revolutionary: nothing about us without us. Today, the movement continues. Life expectancy for people with Down syndrome has risen from single digits in the early 20th century to 60 years and beyond. More adults with Down syndrome live independently, hold jobs, form relationships, and contribute to their communities than ever before. Yet challenges remain. Prenatal screening has made it possible to detect Down syndrome early in pregnancy, and in some countries, termination rates following a diagnosis exceed 90%. Advocates argue that this is not a matter of choice alone, but of a society that still fails to provide adequate support, still struggles to see the full humanity of those who are different. The story is not finished. But what has changed is undeniable. People with Down syndrome are no longer hidden. They are no longer silent. And the world, slowly, is learning to listen.